Welcome back to Journey to XRP. I want you to forget price for a moment because what's happening around XRP right now does not line up with the public narrative at all. And that disconnect is exactly why this moment matters. Regulations are suddenly accelerating. ETF volume is exploding in a down market. Central banks and politicians are rushing timelines that were supposed to take years. None of this is normal behavior. And when things stop behaving normally, it usually means the real decisions have already been made behind closed doors. Stick with me because this isn't about hype or predictions. This is about reading behavior. Markets don't move after announcements. They move before them. Here's what should immediately raise your eyebrows. The SEC just clarified how broker-dealers can custody crypto. They're calling it interim guidance, but don't get distracted by the wording. Custody has always been the biggest choke point. You cannot move trillions of dollars on-chain if institutions don't know who can legally hold assets, how they're recorded, and who carries liability. That uncertainty froze adoption for years, and now, quietly, that door just opened. Interim today almost always means permanent tomorrow. Regulators don't roll out temporary frameworks unless the permanent one is already drafted. This is how they move without triggering retail frenzy. They normalize the change first, then formalize it once positioning is complete. Now look at what happened immediately after. XRP spot ETF volume just printed one of its highest days ever, over $50 million in a single session. And here's the part most people are completely missing. The market was red. Bitcoin was under pressure. Altcoins were bleeding. Retail does not aggressively buy ETFs on red days. Retail chases green candles and momentum. This wasn't that. This was allocation. This was balance sheet money. This was positioning. When ETF volume surges in a down market, it tells you something very specific. Someone isn't speculating. They're executing a model. They're building exposure before something becomes obvious. Markets leak information through volume long before headlines catch up. And it didn't stop there. The following session pushed volume even higher. This wasn't a one-day anomaly or a fat finger trade. Sustained volume means conviction. It means the buying wasn't emotional. It was planned. So ask yourself a simple question. Why XRP? Why now? Because while the public is still debating whether XRP is dead or centralized or boring, regulators, institutions, and central banks are moving pieces that only make sense if settlement, custody, and liquidity infrastructure are about to matter a lot more than speculation. And this brings us to something most people completely misunderstand. Regulatory delays don't mean uncertainty. Sometimes they mean coordination. When lawmakers delay market structure bills like the Clarity Act until 2026, it's not because they don't know what to do. It's because you don't freeze the board while the players are still positioning their pieces. The rules get finalized after the heavy lifting is done, not before. Behind the scenes, Ripple and other major crypto leaders have already met directly with senators to shape how custody, trading rules, and jurisdiction will work for the next decade. That's not theory, that's process. And the public only hears about it once it's no longer actionable. Now layer this on top of what's happening globally. Central banks are accelerating digital currency frameworks. Europe is calling its digital euro timeline urgent. Japan is restructuring its monetary system. Institutions are aligning stablecoin strategies. None of this works without interoperability. None of it works without instant settlement. And none of it works without deep liquidity bridges. This is the part where people get uncomfortable because it forces you to admit something. The loudest narratives are usually the least important. The quiet movements are where real capital shifts happen. XRP ETF volume rising before regulatory finalization is not coincidence. It's preparation. It's the kind of behavior you see when institutions believe the rules are about to favor usability over speculation. Now let's slow this down and actually unpack what's happening here, because if you're only looking at price, you're completely missing the signal. What's unfolding around XRP right now does not match the public narrative at all. And that disconnect is exactly where people usually get blindsided. Let's start with the SEC update, because this is bigger than most headlines are making it. The SEC has now clarified how broker-dealers can custody crypto assets under what they're calling interim rules. And that wording is misleading on purpose. Interim doesn't mean weak. Interim means we're opening the door now while we finalize the permanent framework. Custody has always been the choke point. You cannot move trillions of dollars on-chain if you don't know who is legally allowed to hold assets, how those assets are recorded, and who carries liability when something goes wrong. That uncertainty is exactly what kept institutions on the sidelines for years. And now, suddenly, that uncertainty is being removed piece by piece. This is how regulation actually works in the real world. They don't come out with fireworks and say everything is approved. They quietly publish guidance, let institutions start operating inside those boundaries, and then lock it in permanently once the system is already moving. By the time the public notices, the positioning is already done. And the timing here matters, because look at what happened immediately after. XRP spot ETF volume exploded. We're talking about one of the highest intake days ever, roughly $54 million in volume, followed by continuation the very next day, on pace to push even higher. Here's the key detail that most people are ignoring. This happened in a down market. Bitcoin was getting hit, altcoins were bleeding, sentiment was negative, retail was not rushing in. Retail buys green candles, not red ones. That's just how human psychology works. So if it's not retail, who is it? It's allocation money, balance sheet money, institutional positioning. This is not speculation, this is preparation. Institutions do not chase hype. They move early, quietly, and they build positions when assets are ignored or misunderstood. And this is where you need to stop asking why price hasn't moved yet and start asking why volume is surging when nobody is excited. That's the tell. Markets move before announcements, not after. By the time headlines flip bullish, the easy money is already gone. Now tie this back to what's happening politically. Ripple and other crypto leaders have been meeting directly with U.S. senators about market structure, custody standards, and jurisdiction between the SEC and the CFTC. At the same time, we're told the markup for the market structure bill is delayed until 2026. Most people hear that and think, oh, that's bad news, delays. But that's not how power works. You don't freeze the board while the players are still moving their pieces. When timelines get pushed publicly, it usually means the private work is already far along. The people in the room already know the direction. The public just doesn't yet. And that's why this feels strange. Regulations are moving, ETF volume is exploding, central banks are rushing timelines, and yet the broader market narrative is still confusion and doubt. That gap between reality and perception is where major repricings are born. Now, this is where the narrative completely breaks down for most people, because once you step back and stop looking at price, what you see instead is behavior, and behavior never lies. Let's connect a few dots that, on their own, might look unrelated. Ripple and other major crypto leaders recently met directly with U.S. senators led by Tim Scott to discuss digital asset market structure. That meeting wasn't about hype, and it wasn't about when moon. It was about custody standards, SEC versus CFTC jurisdiction, trading rules, and the framework that will govern this space for the next decade or longer. This is not retail conversation. This is rulebook level conversation. And right after that, we're told the market structure markup is delayed until 2026. Most people hear that and think, oh, that's bad news, more waiting. That's the wrong conclusion. You don't freeze the board while the players are still moving their pieces. You pause public action when private positioning is still underway. The people in those rooms already understand where this ends. The delay isn't uncertainty, it's sequencing. At the same time, you've got major macro voices like Tom Lee coming out and talking about new all-time highs potentially forming early next year. Now, whether you agree with Tom or not isn't the point. What matters is timing. He's pointing to January. That lines up perfectly with regulatory momentum, ETF maturation, and the early stages of liquidity easing. This isn't a price call, it's a timeline alignment. Historically, Bitcoin moves first when liquidity conditions shift. Then capital rotates. And where does it rotate? Into assets that institutions view as infrastructure, not experiments. That's why this matters for XRP. Now add Europe to the equation. Christine Lagarde just called for urgent digital euro regulation. Not we're studying it, not we're exploring it. Urgent, that word matters. Central banks do not rush unless they feel pressure. Pressure from competition, pressure from timelines, pressure from being left behind. CBDCs don't function in isolation. They require interoperability. They require instant settlement. They require neutral liquidity bridges. That's not opinion. That's system design. And this is where people still underestimate XRP's positioning. Look at SBI, one of Ripple's closest institutional partners. Their own investor presentations now openly show a dual stablecoin strategy, one tied to JPY, one tied to USD, with Ripple's RLUSD running on the XRP ledger. That's not speculation, that's documented strategy. Stablecoins are the fuel, settlement rails are the engine, and XRP sits in the middle of that system. This is how banks prepare before retail ever notices. They don't announce it on Twitter. They don't wait for YouTube thumbnails. They quietly build, test, allocate, and lock in access. Now zoom out even further. Look at other crypto ETFs. Most of them are dead, low volume, no urgency, no accumulation signal. But XRP ETFs are doing the opposite. Rising volume before laws pass, before narratives flip, before the crowd gets comfortable. That tells you everything you need to know. This is not retail money. Retail buys green candles and sells red ones. Retail does not pile into ETFs on down days with tens of millions of dollars. Institutions do that when they are positioning ahead of something structural. Markets move before announcements. They always have. And right now, XRP is moving in behavior, not in headlines. That's the part most people miss. Now let's zoom out, because this is where the signal becomes impossible to ignore if you're actually watching behavior instead of listening to noise. When you look across the broader crypto ETF landscape right now, something stands out immediately. Most altcoin ETFs are dead. Low volume, no urgency, no sustained inflows. Doge, Litecoin, Solana, even names people hype nonstop on social media. Nothing is happening there, but XRP is behaving differently. Its ETF volume is rising before regulatory headlines, before laws are passed, before narratives flip bullish. That sequence matters. Markets do not wait for confirmation, they move ahead of it. That's not a theory, that's how capital has always behaved. By the time retail feels comfortable, the positioning is already done. And this is why the argument that retail is pumping XRP ETFs falls apart instantly. Retail doesn't aggressively buy ETFs on red days. Retail chases green candles. Retail reacts. Institutions position. What you're seeing in XRP ETF volume is balance sheet money, allocation money, not hype money. Think about what institutions are looking at right now. Regulators are clarifying custody rules. The SEC is defining how broker-dealers can hold crypto. Central banks are openly rushing digital currency frameworks. Stablecoin regulation is moving forward. Tokenization is no longer theoretical. It's being implemented by Wall Street firms in real time. Against that backdrop, XRP isn't just another asset, it's a settlement rail, it's a liquidity bridge, it's infrastructure that actually benefits from regulatory clarity instead of being hurt by it. That's why capital moves there quietly, not loudly. And here's the part that really messes with people's heads. This is all happening in a down market. Bitcoin is under pressure, alts are bleeding, sentiment is negative, and yet XRP ETF volume is exploding. That combination almost never happens unless someone is positioning ahead of something structural. Markets leak information through behavior, not press releases. Volume tells you more than any influencer ever will. Now add one more layer to this. SBI, one of Ripple's closest institutional partners, has already laid out its stablecoin strategy. One leg in JPY, one leg in USD. USD exposure explicitly tied to RLUSD on the XRP ledger. That's not speculation, that's written strategy. Stablecoins need settlement, settlement needs liquidity, liquidity needs a neutral bridge. XRP sits right in the middle of that system. This is how banks prepare before the public even realizes a transition is underway. They don't announce it, they don't hype it, they accumulate, build, test, and wait. And then one day the narrative flips and everyone pretends it was obvious all along. Now let's pull all of this together, because this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore if you're actually watching behavior instead of listening to noise. Right now, regulators are moving faster than they publicly admit. Central banks are openly saying the word urgent. Institutions are allocating capital quietly through ETFs. And timelines that were supposed to take years are suddenly being compressed into months. That does not happen randomly. Systems don't rush unless pressure is already being applied somewhere behind the scenes. And that's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to face. Markets do not wait for laws to pass. They do not wait for headlines to confirm things. They position before clarity becomes public knowledge. By the time retail sees certainty, the risk reward is already gone. That's how every major financial transition has worked, without exception. This is why XRP ETF volume exploding in a down market matters so much. Not because it guarantees a price move tomorrow, not because it means instant riches, but because it shows who is acting and how they are acting. Institutions don't chase green candles, they don't buy narratives, they buy positioning windows, and they especially buy infrastructure when regulation, custody, and liquidity rails are converging at the same time. Ask yourself this honestly. If nothing important were happening, why would capital be moving into XRP exposure while everything else is being de-risked? Why now? Why before laws are finalized? Why before narratives flip? That question alone should force you to slow down and think. And this is where most people get shaken out, not because they're wrong, but because the process feels boring, confusing, and uncomfortable. Price doesn't immediately reward patience, headlines contradict each other, influencers scream extremes, and meanwhile, the real work is happening quietly in regulatory rooms, banking meetings, and institutional models you'll never see. XRP sits at the intersection of all of this, not because it's trendy, not because it's hyped, but because it solves a problem that becomes more urgent as the system digitizes faster than its rules can keep up. Interoperability, settlement, liquidity bridges. These aren't optional features in a tokenized world. They're mandatory. This doesn't mean straight line price action. It doesn't mean no volatility. And it definitely doesn't mean everyone wins just for showing up. What it means is that the phase has shifted. We're no longer in the does this even matter stage. We're in the how do we roll this out without breaking things stage. And historically, that's the stage where positioning quietly happens, right before repricing. So don't obsess over daily candles. Don't anchor yourself to one date. Don't let silence convince you nothing is happening. Follow behavior, not opinions. Follow flows, not fear. Markets leak information long before they announce it. And right now, XRP is leaking something big. That's all for this one.